I'm Matt Miller, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, author of the 2% Solution and host of KCRW's Left, Right, and Center. And I am delighted to welcome you to the weekend's indispensable panel. Are we making the world safe for democracy? Now, over lunch, I was sitting in the green room lunch area, and somebody said, "What panel are you doing?" And I said, are we making the world safe for democracy? And she said, "Are you going to be focusing on American democracy or on democracy in foreign countries?" And I thought that about probably captured the political center of gravity of the temperament of what may be the LA Times Festival of Books audience. But there's no question we meet at an auspicious moment. A few years after September 11th, we find ourselves deeply committed to a war in Iraq. People are asking, are we building some kind of democracy there? And are we trying to build some kind of democracy perhaps in other places, coming on the heels of various efforts in the 90s and in our history? President Bush, in a sweeping inaugural address that a lot of observers thought out-Wilsoned Woodrow Wilson, seemed to argue that democracy around the world was essential for our own national security. People are asking questions about whether that's right here and abroad. Lots of Americans, as well as our allies, seem unsure of the trajectory of America's role in the world today. Are we on our way to a more crusading military overreach? Is benevolent empire our destiny and needed, as some might say, to assure our security in this complicated, dangerous world? Are darker motives really at work, which some, including some on this panel, may argue? And of course, the question that's atop this audience's mind, I'm guessing, is will the Democratic Party ever figure out what it thinks about all this and how it intends to lead? Well, for all these questions, we couldn't have a more distinguished panel to address this. In a moment, I'll introduce them and ask everyone to give us an introductory set of remarks for 5, 6, 7 minutes, and then we'll mix it up with discussion among us, and obviously leave time for questions and answers with this thoughtful audience. But just to get an orientation of where this group is, I'd be curious, just by a show of hands, if people are comfortable doing it, how many folks in this audience oppose the war in Iraq? Just trying to understand. This is going to be a civil discussion, so those of you who didn't raise your hand, there's room for all that conversation, but it's just useful to understand where we are. So without further ado, and also I want to remind our authors that in the proud LA Times Festival of Books tradition, they should feel free to work their remarks toward their current book with whatever flimsy non sequitur that may entail. Let me briefly introduce all of our panelists, and then we'll go down the line and get some opening remarks. David Reif, to my left, to your right, is an American writer and policy analyst. He's been a consultant for humanitarian organizations, written widely, as all of you know, on topics ranging from war, human rights, humanitarian assistance in Africa, third world immigration. He's covered Bosnia, Sarajevo, Rwanda, most recently a lot of work from Southwest Asia and post-war Iraq. He's the author of 6 books. The most recent, which is just out, is At the Point of a Gun, Democratic Dreams and Armed Intervention, which is just out from Simon & Schuster. Welcome, David Reif. Charles Kessler, immediately to my right and your left, is a professor of government and director of the Henry Salvatori Center at Claremont Mechanic College. He's also the editor of the Claremont Review of Books and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. His edition of the Federalist Papers, which I did not know, published as a Signet Classic, is the best-selling edition of the Federalist Papers in the country. Welcome to you, Charles Kessler. To your far right is Sergio Ramirez, the well-known Nicaraguan novelist and writer who served as vice president of his country during the Sandinista regime under Daniel Ortega. Among his numerous works of fiction and nonfiction are Margarita, How Beautiful the Sea, To Bury Our Fathers, and his latest novel, 1001 Deaths. Welcome to you, Sergio Ramirez. And finally, to the far right, to your far left, and there's no choice of that in the seating, is Amy Goodman, who is the host of Democracy Now! You've heard of it. which airs on more than 300 radio and TV stations across North America and the world. She's won many of the biggest prizes in journalism, including the George Polk Award and the Robert F. Kennedy Prize. Her book, Exception to the Rulers, exposing oily politicians, war profiteers, and the media that love them, has just appeared in paper with a new preface, and I'm told just this week hit the New York Times paperback bestseller list. Welcome to you. We'll begin our discussion with opening remarks, and David Reif, let me start with you.
This is an unexpected blow. All right. Look, let me start by giving you an opinion and then trying to complicate it. I don't believe for one instant that it's possible to impose democracy by force in other places. I don't believe it will work. It's not a question I actually don't think we have any business doing it. But even if I could be persuaded that we had some business doing it, and there are arguments for it, to be fair, I don't actually think it can be done. I don't think democracy is made that way. And I think what happens, and it's not only in what's called democracy building, it's also in all kinds of other activities. What probably this audience would view more benignly, say the creation of civil society in the global south. The kind of things that groups like the Soros Foundation, the Ford Foundation have been involved with for now many decades. I'm actually quite skeptical of whether you can do that. I think you distort the process with your money in this soft version of democracy building, almost as much as you distort your process with your guns and your armored vehicles in the hard sort of Bush administration version of it. I should also say that I think that the human rights movement, perhaps partly unwittingly, but maybe not entirely unwittingly, has also subscribed to a policy, to ideas that support armed interventions in other countries. It's not simply, it would be a great mistake, I think, to imagine that what we're talking about here is the iniquitous neocons in Mr. Cheney's office, and that everybody else has nothing to do with this. If you think, for example, let's take, if I can go away from the human rights movement and towards, say, the European Union, which in many ways stands for a very different set of values from the United States in world politics. The European Union makes as a condition of its aid, and indeed of its participation, not only to countries that want to join the Union, that's legitimate, but countries that get aid from the Union, all over the place in the world, a whole series of norms that these countries have to subscribe to. Now, those might be good norms, but already you are creating a kind of constellation of force. You're saying, in effect, that powerful states have the right to dictate to powerless states what their political arrangements will be. That, it seems to me, you need to think about. You need to think about whether there's as big a difference between Paul Wolfowitz and Human Rights Watch as both of them would want to claim. I'm not so sure there is. Now, let me complicate it. The complication is very simple. If Saddam Hussein had been murdering the Kurds at the time of the invasion, surely a lot of people in this audience would have thought, yes, we're not crazy about the fact that it's the 82nd Airborne or the British Army doing it, but you know, dreams of a better world, when put up against the actual lives of people, can look very feeble. If you don't want to use the Iraq example, use Rwanda. Surely most people would have said that any intervention by any power, whatever you think of the power, would have been better than the deaths of 800,000 people in 6 weeks. Maybe some of you are principled enough to think, or perhaps consistent enough, to think that a non-interventionist position is worth maintaining even under that provocation. But I'm willing to bet most of you don't. And I don't think one should. I think consistency in any case is perhaps not the hobgoblin of small minds, as Emerson said, but not the greatest of virtues and not something that we need to get obsessed about. But that's the problem. Now, in Iraq, the Kurds had been murdered long ago, and the intervention in my view, had very little to do with saving lives. But Human Rights Watch, for example, called for an intervention in the mid-'80s at the time of Halabja. And it would have been an intervention more or less with the same military forces. That's something one needs to think about. But on the larger point, I mean, the point is quite simple. The notion that democracy is either the natural state of people or that genuine democracy can be created by outsiders, playing any role except a very tangential supporting one, seems to me to fly in the face of both history and reason. What we've got is a venture that is seeking to impose the particular version of democratic capitalism that this country stands for in places that are viewed to be of strategic interest. And the European Union is engaged in a huge project of attempting, in effect, to bribe countries into the European social democratic version of that democratic capitalism. Both of them, to me, despite the headlines about the demonstrators in Lebanon or movement in Egypt, very doubtful movement in Egypt, but never mind, seem to me a terrible mistake. And of course, the other issue for us, but most of the people in this room, I presume, are Americans, is what happens when a country decides that the military side of its foreign policy is going to become central. I would submit to you that that country's days as a republic are numbered. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Let's hear now from Charles Kessler. Charles?
Thank you. The phrase, make the world safe for democracy, is of course Woodrow Wilson's. But even Woodrow Wilson distinguished between making the world safe for democracy and making it democratic. The latter is, in my view, impossible, because America cannot make other countries democratic if they don't, in the long run, choose to be democratic. Besides, even if it were possible to make other peoples democratic, it would be undemocratic to do so, at least in one sense of the term. And again, even if it were possible, it would be unnecessary, because the world can be rendered safe for democracy without making it entirely democratic. Is the world getting safer for democratic regimes then? Well, it would certainly seem so if the stunning multiplication in the number of democracies in recent years is any evidence. We have not only the Ukraine and most of Eastern Europe, but Afghanistan, the experiment in Iraq now, events in Lebanon, and so forth, all of which are well known, but a trend towards democracy that goes back into the 1970s and Portugal and Spain's democratization beginning in the 70s and 80s. Democracy's spread over so many climates and races and cultures might seem to confirm that democracy is somehow fated or historically inevitable. A thesis advanced long ago by Alexis de Tocqueville and more recently in a more dogmatic form by Francis Fukuyama. Indeed, President Bush has sometimes patronized the so-called inevitability thesis, declaring occasionally and loosely that liberty is the direction of history, for example, or that, quote, history moves in the direction of justice, unquote. But I believe it would be a grave mistake to embrace the anodyne doctrine that democracy is inevitable. In fact, democracy's health and its consequent spread have had much to do with America's choices. The world is, I would submit, safer for democracy today because the U.S. chose to engage and humble democracy's foes. The Nazis, Soviet communism, rightly called an evil empire, and now Islamic totalitarianism. That much of democracy's progress in the world is the direct or indirect result of the policies of America's most conservative presidents of both parties, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, frustrates and infuriates the left, not to mention several of my fellow panelists. But the left's irrelevance in the whole debate about global democratization confirms how stultifying its precepts, particularly its growing and now almost inveterate anti-Americanism, have become. America is, of course, not the only cause of democracy's recent advances, but I would submit it is in many respects the main cause by its policies and by its example. By our policies, the U.S. has helped to create the conditions for democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, as earlier we had done in Germany and Japan. But we cannot guarantee its success, even in the lands that we have helped to liberate. Our example and our principles can and should be a great influence, but in the end, it is up to the Iraqis to make and keep Iraq democratic. And of course, our own example can't be taken simply as a template or model. They must deliberate and decide what is best for themselves, finding their own democratic or at least non-tyrannical way of securing their safety and happiness. So America cannot make the world democratic, but it can help and has helped to secure the democratic world. That is, the world of the democracies in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and even the Middle East. In so doing, the United States has always and rightly had an eye to its own security and way of life. That too is perfectly democratic. And paradoxically, it is a necessary condition for democracies thriving abroad. In short, the best way to make the world safe for Ukrainian or Afghan democracy is to make the world safe for American democracy.
Thanks very much, Charles Kessler. And let's hear now from Sergio Ramirez.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to switch to an area of the world that I better know, which is Latin America. Since the end of the Cold War, democracy has been established in the Western world without challenge, at least in its former shape. If we take Latin American countries as an example, governments have been elected periodically for the last 20 years. Military dictatorships have disappeared. But has democracy been going smoothly? Certainly, democracy has today new and old foes, four of which I would like to mention here: authoritarianism, corruption, economic failures, and drug traffic. First, we don't have now military governments, but elected presidents sometimes choose to act in an authoritarian way and try to use institutions and instruments of their own personal power, abusing that power. This whole character of our history, the caudillo, the strong man, is always emerging from his sarcophagus to threaten the fragile advance to democracy, like in Nicaragua, for example. And caudillos are very often linked to populism. What modernization really means in political terms is that the law and the institutions can be stronger than individuals. Second, corruption is also an old disease in Latin America. It seems a contradiction, but it has been renewed as a result of the spreading of free elections. And along with economic failures, it has caused in recent times at least 8 presidents to be prosecuted and in most of the cases removed from office in Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Argentina. It is ironic that those who are democratically elected become the principal enemies of democracy, generating among electors suspicion, lack of trust, and frustration. Third, at the beginning of the last decade, of the last century, the triumph of democracy was presented as the triumph of the market, and the market itself was charged with the task of bringing immediate economic prosperity. To this end, states would stay away from any economic activity, would privatize all public enterprises, including public services, and would bring to an end the welfare state that never existed in Latin America by drastic reductions in public expenditures for social services. What we have managed to install, however, has not been a market economic, but a market society, which is very different. Most of the people, even the middle class, have seen their living standard deteriorate, and at the same time, wealthy people have become even wealthier. This enormous and increasing social gap is a permanent source of instability, as has been demonstrated only recently in Ecuador with the overthrowing of President Lucio Gutierrez. Fourth, and drug traffic. This is a very serious menace, capable of eroding the very foundation of the state and making a mockery out of democracy. The ability of drug cartels to buy judges, courts, police officers, and even high-ranking officers in the government transforms the lords of the drug trafficking key power players. And even worse, it gives them the ability to intervene in armed conflicts, like in Colombia, in alliance with all the sides, the guerrilla and the paramilitary. But are we better before in spite of those black holes? Certainly yes. We must consider the exercise of democracy being so young among us as a process of trial and error. Hopefully, people will elect better candidates as the exercise of democracy continues without interruptions. I believe that no other system can substitute democracy in Latin America, even with its current imperfections. We must keep electing freely, of course, and what have we won? We no longer have death squads or clandestine jails or desaparecidos. We no live under brutal repression like in the past under military dictatorships. We are not thrown in jail because of our opinions. We have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom from fear. And there exists a myriad of organizations in many different fields that represent civil society, ranging from human rights organizations to environmental defense groups. Finally, after many years, people are electing socialist parties into government, trying to find a different approach to the long-cherished solutions to poverty, marginality, and backwardness. We have now that kind of a government in Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina, for example, and a similar government could be elected in Mexico in the next year. What does this mean? First of all, that the left-wing parties must demonstrate that they are able to govern a country without creating insoluble polarizations and without dividing society, but also that they are able to bring forth real solutions to social problems, which is the essence of social problems, which is the essence of their programs. And I would say the reason of their existence as political entities. A most difficult task indeed, but those are the ways of democracy and what democracy allows us in Latin America, that ideas can become realities. Thank you.
Amy Goodman.
The Bush administration, with the support of the establishment Democratic Party, has endangered democracy around the world. And I want to stay here in this hemisphere to begin by talking about Haiti. Here is a perfect example. It should be celebrating its Jubilee year, 2004. It would have been 200 years old, born of a slave uprising in 1804, the oldest black republic in the world. President Aristide in 2004 had been re-elected. He was the first democratically elected president 10 years ago. And on February 29th, 2004, he was ousted in yet another coup, as he was flown off with his wife Mildred Aristide to a remote area of Africa, the Central African Republic. He got in touch with people here. March 1st, we broadcast on Democracy Now! He said he was the victim of a modern kidnapping in the service of a coup d'etat backed by the United States. Just before I came on the stage, I got a call that said that Prime Minister Yvonne Neptune of Haiti, under Aristide, is now was just beaten up very badly on Friday morning. He's been in prison for almost a year since the ouster of the Aristide government, no charge, pleading with all for him to be released. And President Aristide just held a news conference in South Africa where he's in exile, saying he remains the president. And we have to look very seriously at the role of the United States in yet another coup there. February 29th, what Aristide said, I flew with him back from the Central African Republic to Jamaica when Congressmember Maxine Waters from here in Los Angeles and Randall Robinson went to the Central African Republic in a small plane to retrieve the Aristides, calling the bluff of the most powerful country on earth here in the United States. When we landed, as we were landing in Jamaica, I covered the trip, President Aristide was being threatened by Rice, Rumsfeld, and Powell, and they said he was not to return to this hemisphere. Whose hemisphere? And the U.S. ambassador to Haiti, James Foley, was saying he was not to return within 150 miles of Haiti. Whose country? And today, hundreds of Aristide supporters have been locked up. The Prime Minister is in a very dangerous situation. He could possibly die. And what is the U.S. doing but working with those that ousted President Aristide once again? And we don't have to just stop in Haiti. Let's look at Aceh, right? This is the country that was so hard, the area of the world, a province of Indonesia, that was so hard hit on December 26th by the tsunami. If you mentioned the word Aceh before December 26th, people would probably say, God bless you. But after December 26th, we learned what that place was, because it's believed about 200,000 Achenese died in this natural catastrophe, the hardest hit. But Aceh has been hit by 2 tsunamis, not only the natural catastrophe, but the catastrophe, the tsunami, that is the Indonesian army. And very little coverage of that area talked about the state of siege declared by the Indonesian military. What happened soon after December 26th? The Deputy Defense Secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, went to Aceh, returned. He, by the way, is a former U.S. ambassador to Indonesia. He was there for a number of the years of the slaughter in Timor, one of the great genocides of the 20th century. He comes back to the United States and restores military training aid to the Indonesian military, which had been cut off in 1999 under President Clinton, under tremendous pressure on President Clinton, had been cut off when the people of East Timor voted for their freedom in a UN-sponsored referendum, and the Indonesian military burned East Timor to the ground. This is the army that the Bush administration has now restored military training aid to. And now Paul Wolfowitz becomes the president of the World Bank. And you have to wonder if he's going to use countries' monies, if he sees the definition of development as shoring up repressive regimes and armies. Then you turn, of course, to Iraq and what has happened in Iraq. I mean, you have the Bush administration that invades Iraq with the leading Democratic presidential contender, John Kerry, supporting the invasion, John Edwards supporting the invasion. And even when it became very clear, though it was before, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and President and Senator Kerry was asked if he knew then what he knew now, would he support the invasion? He said yes. So this was a bipartisan affair, and we don't know the numbers of Iraqis who have died, though according to a study by Johns Hopkins, Columbia University, and Baghdad University, it's believed somewhere around 100,000 Iraqi civilians have died. I don't think this is a success story. And before we finish up talking about democracy in the world, I think it's most important to talk about the most important component of people's understanding of the world, and that is the media. More powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile, the Pentagon has deployed the US media, and we have to unembed it. We have not seen what has happened in Iraq. It's very difficult to assess because of the kind of military hardware show, the kind of game, the kind of video game that the US media has presented to us in Iraq. You have to compare the US media's coverage of Iraq with the rest of the world's coverage, and the difference is frightening. Someone recently quipped, what's the difference between the US media and Al Jazeera? The US media shows where the missiles take off. Al Jazeera shows where they land. I raise the media as a part of what is happening in the world today because it is such a powerful weapon right now. They are the most powerful institutions on earth. And they have reached an all-time low in this country. And I think that's where the focus of activism should be right now. Because I really do think that if people saw in this country for just 1 week what it has looked like in Iraq over the last 2 years, babies dead on the ground, women with their legs blown off from cluster bombs, if we saw the body bags of U.S. soldiers come home and the flag-draped coffins, President Bush has invoked this executive order that says that they cannot be videotaped or photographed. And when was the last time you saw a seriously injured U.S. soldier? They are brought home under cover of night, purposely. If we really saw the reality of war, I'm not for reality TV, but I do think we need a little reality TV when it comes to war. If we saw these images for just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people, and I think that Americans would say no to war, that it is not an answer to conflict in the 21st century, and it is certainly not an answer to making the world safer for democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. It's awful when you antagonize the audience in that way by taking on their deepest beliefs. Let's talk a little bit among ourselves. We'll leave time for Q&A. Let me ask you, there's so many issues that are important that have been raised in different ways by all our panel. Just quickly, Amy, I'd be curious, on your perspective, if it's sort of asking you the John Kerry question in reverse. If we had found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq the way people like Bill Clinton, for example, told the American people were there, would that have changed your view about the pros and cons of this invasion?
I think that we have to look at history. I think that is very important in all of these cases. That what became somewhat of a famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld shaking the hand of Saddam Hussein in 1983, 1984, when he went as the Reagan-Bush envoy to Iraq to normalize relations with Saddam Hussein, when they knew at that point, both the State Department had come out with a report that week, as well as the UN, that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons. This was 20 years ago. And they're, even knowing what Saddam Hussein had done, the Reagan-Bush administration moved forward with shoring up Saddam Hussein. I don't think he would have remained as a military tyrant there for the next 2 decades if the US companies, German companies, British companies hadn't ensured that he retained the kind of tyrannical power that he had. It was up to the U.S. The U.S. determined that he remained in power, and I think we should look back then.
So that means that's a no. Even if they had found WMD, even though we may think that it was done 20 years ago was a mistake, even if he had WMD, it'd be a mistake to have invaded now.
Oh, and I think that if the U.S. simply withdrew support from Saddam Hussein, he would have, the people of Iraq would have been able to handle their own affairs.
Okay. David Reif, a question for you, and others should feel free to jump in, but one of the things that strikes me about the power of your new book is you describe an evolution in your own thinking on this stuff, and that in the 90s you were one of those on the liberal side who were saying maybe this was time for an age of liberal imperialism. Was that the title of the article, I think, that's included in the collection? And that with some, I guess, what's so interesting about your, the way you grapple with this in your book is you describe an evolution that's intellectually honest and troubled and passionate. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to go from one place to the other on this and what that suggests for where all of us should be thinking nowadays?
Well, I think people try to think should challenge their own assumptions, not only the assumptions of their adversaries. And I do think, you know, one's own pieties are certainly equal, should be, you know, not off limits. I started in the work I do in the siege of Sarajevo, watching, you know, somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 shells land in Sarajevo every day, and knowing that my country could have, with very little military power, stopped this slaughter. I was in, the Rwandan genocide, again, the 82nd Airborne, or a British Army or the French Army, or frankly, the South African Army. One of the scandals of the Rwandan genocide is that the Mandela government declined to do anything when it had the military capacity to do so. It's not only the West. And I thought, look, if these are my choices in these slaughterhouses between having people saved, doesn't solve anything politically, I never thought it did, but simply saving people's lives and giving a victory to American imperialism or British imperialism or UN imperialism, because frankly there is such a thing. Frankly, the lives weighed more for me. And that's the way I spent the 90s. I spent the 90s in South Sudan, in Liberia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, in other wars, not this war. I was in this war too. I still am troubled by that, because in a massacre, I'm not sure one's opinions about one's own government or other governments matter all that much. As I said before, weigh all that much. What I am sure of is that it's very different to use warfare, and I'm afraid I don't believe the 21st century is any different than the 20th or the 19th or the 18th or any other. I think war, like the poor, will always be with us, as a good book says. I think that what changed my mind was the sense that I have that both on the Bush administration side, what I think of as, this neoconservative Wilsonianism, this idea that we can remake the world in our own image, which Mr. Kessler calls democratic. I'm more skeptical of that, but we could argue about that. But that both on that side, if you like, the muscular utopianism of the right and the human rights left, as evidenced by people like Samantha Power, whose book is a brief for military intervention all over the world, that we were suddenly, that war was becoming the principal means of our diplomacy, that in effect both sides, the human rights left and the militant international right of the Bush administration, viewed war as the mechanism, as the Archimedean lever for making the world a better place. And that won't do, because war, even just war, is about the slaughter of innocents. Again, Amy Goodman says if you saw war on your television screens, the American people are a compassionate people. I don't know if the American people are any more compassionate than anyone else, frankly, but that's another conversation too. But I think American exceptionalism, both in the, as it were, the official version and the Chomskyite flipped version is equally preposterous.
I don't think Americans are any more compassionate than anyone else, but Americans can determine a lot of policy in the world because we come from the most powerful country on earth.
War, just war and unjust war, is about children slaughtered and about, it's not about that. It's about, I mean, if you're taking a pacifist position, that's fine. But if you're talking about war, any kind of justifiable war, that war is going to produce those images you rightly mentioned. And I don't want war as, I've seen much too much war in the last 15 years to believe, I've lived in wars for the last 15 years. I am not someone who can accept the idea that in order to bring a just world, that war should be basically a primary response as opposed to an exceptional response, which I think it will always have to be. And that's where things change. And then, of course, the appropriation of human rights language by the Bush administration. The fact all great ideas from Christianity forward have been hijacked by power. There's absolutely no reason why human rights shouldn't be the latest in that list, and I think it has been. The idea that the moral warrant for American hegemony is now human rights. At that point, I want to take a big step back and say, no, one's prejudice should be, without going all the way to pacifism, should be that one doesn't do these things, except in those exceptional cases, a Rwanda and possibly a Darfur, where the massacre is ongoing, where the blood is on the ground as we speak.
Let me thank them. I want to get just a couple more questions in, but start to formulate your own because there should be microphones on either side of the aisle somewhere. And after a couple quick questions, I want to get yours in. Sergio Ramirez, I'd be curious if a U.S. president, maybe not this U.S. president, but a U.S. president asked your counsel on how American power could help correct the imperfections of Latin American democracy you talk about. I mean, if you describe a big picture of some progress with many remaining imperfections, what ought be the American role in helping move that toward a better outcome as you see it?
I think that in the past we have taken many of those advices, and not for the better.
But what would you be advising an American president that he ought to be doing? Or she?
Well,
as the case may be.
I would like the government, this or any other government of the United States to keep away from the problems in Latin America. You know, history is the best teacher in this in this way. Well, I can talk since the point of view of the citizen of a country which has been invaded many times for the United States. At the beginning of the 20th century, at the midst of the before the midst of this 20th century too, for installing right-wing governments and at the end a military dictatorship that lasted in Nicaragua for 50 years, the Somoza's dictatorship. But now it is very peculiar that, for example, in Haiti, the government of the United States, in this case the Clinton administration, intervened to install or to reinstall President Aristide in power. And that was the first time that the troops of the United States invade the country to reinstall a left-wing president. That is very peculiar.
And yet at the same time, the U.S. CIA and DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, had on the payroll Emmanuel Constant, the head of the FRAP, the paramilitary death squad that was responsible for so much of the killing through that period. Yeah. It was as if they removed Aristide to get him to cry uncle, to say he would not fight the neoliberal economic model that the U.S. was pushing. And once there was so much bloodshed, he was brought back on a military jet. He said he would not extend his term in office.
Well, it is the reason why I call it peculiar. Yeah, and I would like to see the United States not intervening to install any kind of government in Latin America, being of the left, being of the right, or to depose any kind of government. I think we are mature enough to handle our own affairs.
Could I ask Sergio one quick question, sure, just to get your reaction to the confirmation of John Negroponte as the Director of National Intelligence, the former U.S. ambassador to Honduras, which was the training ground for the in support of the Contra War?
Well, we have a lot of experiences with Mr. Negroponte too. He was the ambassador in Honduras, and he directly directed the forces of the Contra against Nicaragua. That is the experience I have with Mr. Negroponte.
Let me give Charles Kessler a last word here, and I don't want you may be outnumbered. And I don't want to portray you as a full-throated supporter of current administration policy, because you're not, as you articulated and as I read. But just to tee it up as a last question before we go to the audience's questions, I remember President Bush, I think it was at the Republican convention last year, read some editorial from the New York Times right after World War II, I think, bemoaning, he was quoting the Times, that the occupation in Germany was an abject failure. Didn't we realize that we should never have been trying to do what we were doing in Germany, that it was a hopeless thing? And then Bush very smugly, I think, said, you know, the New York Times is still writing those editorials 50 years later. Is it not possible to have any hope that from what on the ground, through the incredible on-the-scenes reportage that, including what people on this panel have borne witness to, that 20 years from now we may look back and say something better is coming out of this than many of us now expect?
No, I think it's possible, very possible. I'm not sure that you'll have a fully functioning liberal democracy in Iraq of the kind that we might like to see, but I think you'll have something that is non-tyrannical and that is much better than the bloodthirsty regime of Saddam Hussein. Iraq is not a perfect case for democracy. I mean, it doesn't have many of the preconditions that one would look for if one were picking a country to try to encourage democratic growth in. Nonetheless, when the people of Iraq gave Saddam the purple finger in the election, I think they indicated that they had something of the pride and the spiritedness, and even, you might say, the love of freedom that is necessary in a democracy. So there are some encouraging signs there. I would also say, of course, that if it hadn't been for the war, if it had been for the invasion, you would not have had men and women voting in Iraq. You would not have had men and women voting in Afghanistan. And although the toll on the Iraqis civilians has been high in the war, the toll exacted on them by Saddam Hussein over many years of dictatorship was exceedingly higher than the casualties in the war. So war is a terrible thing, but it is not the most terrible thing. And there are circumstances when it is justified. If the WMDs had been found, it would have been a slam dunk. Thank you.
No heckling. Let's have everyone's...
But in many ways, Saddam brought this on himself. He never lived up to the agreements he made at the end of the 1991 conflict. And he continued to behave very suspiciously about WMDs and other things. And he was a fountain of anti-American and tyrannical behavior at home and in the whole region.
Thanks, Charles. Let us go now. We're going to go to your questions. I'm going to try and get in as many as I can because we have brief time. So what I'll insist on is questions, not speeches or statements. And I'd like everyone to just identify themselves and then please ask their questions. Sir.
My name is Chris Ross, and I thank you for being here today. And Charles Kessler, I really enjoy the Claremont Review of Books, so thank you too.
Thank you. Thanks for the plug.
I'm a conservative, but I have a sincere question, especially for the members of the panel on the left. As I talk with my liberal friends about the war, it quickly becomes apparent that there's a large gap between us, not just about the war, but on basic principles. And I want to find out, because my liberal friends are not able to elucidate them for me, I would really like to understand what the basic principles of the liberal worldview are. No, I'm serious. I mean,
now we only have about. Does it have to do with in particular with the use of force, or because that could take up another panel and a half?
Well, I just mean that for my conservative friends, we can rattle off 4 or 5 principles. If you can just rattle off 4 or 5 things that are basic.
Anyone want to take a quick crack at this at all? No? Pained looks?
I think it's a provocation, this question. I have to tell you, if anyone can enumerate serious principles, as you put it, you know, rattle off 4 or 5, I would argue for the lack of seriousness of those principles.
Let's leave that as a debate that's going to hang in the air because we don't have time to have them all. Sir, let me go to you.
My question is to the audience.
We're actually having questions for the panel.
All right. To the panel. First of all, please, for those of you who are not aware of this book, I highly recommend it.
Sir, I'm afraid we've got very little time. Many people with a question. I'm gonna ask you to either state a question or I'll cut you off.
Question. In a world where the economies of China, India, Nicaragua, Mexico, Latin America, Africa are increasingly interconnected, and the United States dominates that world with an active military presence in 36 countries, what can the rest of the world do when the people of America, who have the largest combined military spending in the world, you know, the U.S. spends more than the rest of the world combined on its military, do to influence foreign policy, to U.S. policy here? My question is this. Democracy, right? 20% of China's exports...
So I'm going to take that as the end of your question, sir, and let you frame it that way in terms of what
Amy, Mr. Kessler, this question is to you.
Amy?
32, a world survey was done recently.
Sir, sir, with all respect, we understand the general nature of the question.
32 of 35 countries around the world said that they did not want Bush as president. What is the world supposed to do when the American
Amy,
people
would you like
voted
to?
him into power.
Let me respond to your question. I mean, I think it's up to the people of the United States. It's, yes, that is the feeling of people around the world. And I don't think that the majority of people in this country have spoken. And I do want to say that I don't think it's predictable where people fall. I think all of the political labels are breaking down now. I think conservative Republicans, like progressives, share a lot of values around issues of corporate control, privacy, an out-of-control war budget, issues around Social Security, for example. And I do think that Bush is managing to unite people across the political spectrum against him.
Well, I mean, world poverty has taken a dramatic decrease in the last 10 years as the economies of India and China have become integrated into a liberal trading order. One of the things that can be done to alleviate the imbalance of economic welfare in the world is to increase globalization, to increase the liberal trading order. And what most countries do in respect of that is to free ride on the United States as the country with the largest military to enforce the conditions of a liberal trade order, which are in fact good for everyone. Most third world countries don't suffer from oppressive multinational corporations, they suffer from being neglected by multinational corporations.
You may not agree, but it's a totally legitimate perspective, so I think people should let him have his say. Sir, brief question.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Thompson. I'm a Sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. Proudly served in Iraq 2 tours. And I actually have a really simple question for the lady on the far left. Ma'am, I'd just like to know what your qualifications are for talking about what is going on in Iraq, because I think you're way off base, and I'd just like to know what exactly your qualifications are for talking about what is going on there.
Well, let me ask you what your experience was like. Were you in Iraq?
Yes, ma'am. I served 2 tours in Iraq, one in Nasiriyah and on the southern area of Baghdad, and I served a 2nd tour. I just got back in October from Fallujah.
And what is your feeling about why the United States was in Iraq?
My feeling, ma'am, about why we're in Iraq is we're there to help those people. And to tell you the truth, the dictatorship under Saddam Hussein was a lot worse than I think anybody in the United States has any idea what it was actually like. Finding torture victims, mass graves.
Please let this gentleman talk.
The things that we saw happen over there, I think weapons of mass destruction is a moot issue. It's, regardless of why we went in there in the first place, we're doing the right thing there now, and 99.9% of the people there, including the people in Fallujah and in Ramadi, and the places where U.S. troops are most often shot at and most often ambushed and attacked, the people even in those areas are extremely glad to have us there. And that's the truth of the matter. I don't think that's getting across to mainstream United States.
I'd also wonder about your response to the level of resistance right now in the military. How do you feel about your fellow soldiers who are saying no? For example, I think at this point there are more than 5,500 U.S. servicemen, women and men who are saying no to going to Iraq. And right to the highest levels of the military, the kind of questioning that has gone on, not of why you went, you were sent, but of why the U.S. is there to begin with, and why so many servicemen and women have had to die to be there. What do you think of your fellow soldiers who are saying no to going?
I think in response to what the other soldiers think is generally the ones that are having problems over there are not the infantrymen, not the military police, not the construction workers, not the ones that are out helping the Iraqi people. A lot of the problem is the people that are stuck on a 12, 13-month deployment, and they're stuck inside a base, and they're not seeing what's actually going on, what help we're doing for those people. And they haven't seen the things that Saddam Hussein's regime did to the Iraqi people. So they're not getting any of the benefits of going over there, seeing what we're doing that's good. All they're getting is a 14-month, 12-month, 13-month deployment where they're away from their families, they're in an extremely hot, hostile environment, and like I said, they're getting all the crappy parts of it, but they're not getting any of the good feedback.
I appreciate your comments, sir. We've just got time for one last question. This gentleman here.
Thank you. This is a question first for Professor Charles Kessler and to the rest of the panel second. how can Afghanistan and Iraq be properly referred to as quote-unquote democracies if their people do not and will not retain the right to determine their own economic destinies using their own energy resources? How is democracy a relevant term for any nation if core economic circumstances are ultimately dictated from nations or financial institutions abroad?
Well, I guess I would quarrel with the premise of your question. I don't think that they are...
Can you please define the premise of my question
for
the audience?
I'm trying to get there. They aren't fully functioning democracies yet. They're nascent democracies at best, and they have a way to go. They have a way to go to full sovereignty in the international order as well. That will come as their domestic government and economy come more and more back into line and under their control. It doesn't seem to me that the oil in the ground will, I mean, whoever is in control of Iraq will want to pump the oil. The question is to whom the revenue will go. And I am completely unpersuaded that that revenue is not going to land in the hands of the Iraqis, and is already beginning to land in the hands of the Iraqis.
Will they have the right to sell their oil and natural gas to China, to India, to whoever they wish without foreign intervention?
I think they will.
Well,
Thank you.
In the time-honored tradition of panels, we can say on this question and all the others that were raised today, only time will tell. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. There will be a book signing immediately following this in an area that I don't know the north. In the north area, line E in the north area. Please meet our authors, have them sign books. Thank you all for joining in this conversation.